times I've read our gospel lesson for this morning. And to be quite honest, over the years I've read it, countless times. But it's just never done much for me. Maybe that's because, with the exception of the healing of Simon's mother-in-law, this passage functions kind of as a transition, a summary of what has gone before and what is about to occur, and then on through the rest of the gospel. But even the healing of Simon's mother-in-law, at least at first glance, doesn't seem like all that big a deal. At least not to me, it doesn't. It's just a fever, after all. Jesus and his disciples had just left the synagogue. We read last week how he healed a man or cast out an evil spirit from a man. Well, they left the synagogue, and then they come to the Simon and Andrew, where they find Simon's mother-in-law with the fever. Mark tells us that they shared this information with Jesus. He then went to her, took her by the hand, lifted her up, and when he did so, the fever left. When I say that, it doesn't seem like that much of a big deal to me. Please don't misunderstand. I don't mean to be irreverent. Don't mean to be irreverent at all. It's just that, compared to some of the other things that we will read about later on in the Gospel of Mark, this just doesn't seem all that serious. For as we go through the Gospel of Mark, we will read accounts of how Jesus heals a paralytic, how he makes a withered hand whole, how he restores a man to sanity after casting out the evil spirit that had been tormenting him, why he even brings a little girl back to life who died. In addition, we will read about how Jesus feeds over 5,000 people with just a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. He walks on water. He calms a storm at sea. Gives sight to the blind. Come on now, folks. Compared to all of that, healing a fever doesn't seem like all that big a deal, does it? But on second thought, I suppose that all depends, doesn't it? And what it depends on is whose fever it is. If it happens to be your fever, or the fever of somebody that you love or know or care about, then it is a big deal, isn't it? It's kind of like the definition of major surgery. You know what major surgery is? Major surgery is what I'm having. Minor surgery is what everybody else has. It doesn't matter what kind of surgery it is. If it happens to me or if it happens to somebody I love, that's major surgery. That's when it hit me. Maybe that's what this story is all about. In the healing of Simon's mother-in-law, we see that Jesus is concerned not only with the big things in life. Jesus' compassion and heart goes out to anyone, regardless of what it is that concerns them or what problem they may be dealing with. In a world filled with crises and tragedies and unbelievable pain and suffering, in a world where there are things like cancers and heart attacks and AIDS and Alzheimer's, in a world where loved ones come home from wars in flag-draped coffins, in a world where bodies are maimed in traffic accidents, in a world where lives are devastated because of drugs and alcohol, in a world where marriages and families are marred because of unfaithful spouses or abusive parents. In this kind of world, the good news of the gospel is that not only can we go to Jesus with such catastrophic and life-threatening concerns as these, but we can also go to Jesus with things such as fevers and concern over how our children are doing in school. And when we or someone we love may be suffering with the flu any other number of things that, compared to the major traumas recorded on the Richter scale of life, may not even measure a 2 or a 3 if they even make the needle jump at all. The good news of the gospel is that if the needle jumps on our own personal Richter scale, Jesus notices and he cares. Didn't Jesus say that God takes note when even a single sparrow falls to the ground? And that even the very hairs on our head are numbered. Now, I know that when it comes to numbering the hairs on our head, for some of us, John and I and others, that's not that big a challenge for God. But the point that Jesus is raising is simply that God notices and God cares about even the smallest and perhaps even most mundane aspects of our lives. How does the hymn, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus," put it? What a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Everything. Not just some things, not just certain things, but everything. What a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear. Not just some, not just certain ones. It doesn't say they have to be of a certain magnitude before we can take them to God. It says all our sins and griefs. Years later, who's also known as Peter, writes a series of letters that we find toward the back of the New Testament. And when he wrote his first letter, he says, "Cast all your cares on him because he cares for you." I wonder if when he wrote that line, I wonder if the inspiration for it didn't come that day 3 years earlier when Jesus is just starting off in ministry. And they stopped by his house and he remembers how Jesus cared enough about his mother-in-law to heal her fever. And did you notice the word all in what he wrote? Cast all your cares on him. Again, not just some, not certain ones, not just the really big ones, but cast all your cares on him because he cares for you. Let me ask you, what kind of a parent wouldn't grieve if their child didn't make the team, or if he or she did, they didn't get to play very much? If you're a parent, wouldn't it break your heart if your child was the only one in the neighborhood that was not invited to a friend's birthday party? What kind of a parent wouldn't be concerned if their child came home with a poor grade on a test, or if their child was teased or made fun of at school? Now, in the total scope of things, such occurrences wouldn't even rate being mentioned on the slowest news day of the week in the paper. But if they happen to be your child, you're concerned, aren't you? Of course you are. So why do we think it would be any different with God? For after all, we are God's children, aren't we? I've known some people over the years who only go to God with the really big stuff in life. Somewhere, somehow, they've gotten the idea that they shouldn't bother God with the little stuff. They think they should be able to handle the little stuff on their own. But the more I've thought about that, the more I've realized that maybe if we went to God when our problems were smaller, they might not become bigger later on. As I thought about this, I thought of other experiences I've had of people I've known who only go to God for help when they're at their end of the rope. And then again, I've also thought to God earlier when their problems were smaller. Maybe they might not find themselves at the end of their rope sometime down the road. For in Jesus we see the good news of the gospel is that no problem is too big for God. But the good news of the gospel is also that there is no problem that is too small for God to care about, to even notice. For the same Jesus who fed over 5,000 people with just a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish, the same Jesus who calmed a storm at sea and who made the blind to see and the deaf to hear, the same Jesus who healed a woman who had been suffering with hemorrhages for 12 years and who brought a little girl back to life after she had died, the same Jesus who healed a paralytic and cast out of people, is the same Jesus who healed Simon's mother-in-law of a fever. And as the old gospel hymn goes, what he's done for others, he'll do for you. Praise be to God.